Hello and welcome to this virtual presentation of Phenomenal Consciousness Ain't in the Back of the Head. My name is Richard Brown, and this is a rehearsal of a talk that I've been invited to give to the Southern Society for Philosophy and Psychology, coming up here March 22 through 24 in Savannah, Georgia. So I'm very pleased to accept this invitation and put together some ideas that I've been working on for a little bit now with respect to the nature of phenomenal consciousness and the debate between Ned Block and David Rosenthal over whether there are counterexamples to the higher order theory of consciousness. So what I want to argue today, roughly, is that for all we know right now, phenomenal consciousness may be nothing but a higher order thought-like representation of some first order mental state. So I'm not arguing that what we do know is that this is true, but that the higher order, some version of a higher order theory could be true. There's evidence that supports it, and so it could be true. And to put this in a slightly different way, the possible world where consciousness just is a higher order thought-like representation is fairly close in logical space. If not the actual world, it's fairly close. And for my purposes, really, that's the more interesting thesis, since overall part of a larger argument, thinking about zombies and possibility and conceivability and so on. So I'm not really going to be so worried about whether or not we should really think that this theory is true, although there are some defenders of it who do think that, like for instance perhaps David Rosenthal and others really think that they have a good case that it is in fact true. I'm merely wanting to make the case that it could be true, given everything that we know right now. It could, in fact, be the case. So there are really two parts to the argument I want to present. So there's one philosophical argument, and then I want to consider some empirical arguments, and both of these arguments will be concerned with the same issue, which is could it really be the case that phenomenal consciousness is just a higher order thought-like representation of another representation? So let's go ahead and begin. I want to start with the philosophical argument, and the argument I want to consider is the one that Ned Block has recently been talking about, and in particular in his paper called The Higher Order Approach to Consciousness is Defunct. So I've talked about this problem before, and I want to talk about it again, but from a slightly different point of view. Instead of thinking of it as a problem, I'm going to think of it as an argument for thinking of the higher order theory in a particular way. So I want to put a little bit of a spin on it. But before we do that, let's remind ourselves of what the issue was supposed to be. So I'm just going to adopt this convention. Let's just pretend that this is your mind here, and that little translucent square is a first order representation of yellow, and it's not conscious. That's why it's kind of translucent. So don't be confused by a little bit of yellow experience that you're having. This is supposed to be an unconscious first order representation. So now So now, on one way of thinking about the higher order theory, what's going on when you have the higher order thought is that the higher order thought somehow makes the first order state light up. And this is definitely the way that Ned Block seemed to be thinking about the higher order thought theory, and there are others out there who think of the theory in this way. And if you think of it in that way, then you're going to have a question, you're going to have this issue of, well, what happens when the first order state is not there? There's nothing to light up. So it looks like there are two parts to the theory, a necessary and a sufficient condition. You have the necessary condition that the first order state be there, a sufficient condition be the higher order state. But now it looks like we have a problem, since we have the higher order state here, and that's sufficient for consciousness. But there's no first order state to actually light up. And so this looks like it could be a problem. Now, the response that's come from people like Josh Weisberg, people like David Rosenthal, and others is to really distinguish two senses or two concepts of phenomenal consciousness that seem to be at work here. So, on the one hand, you have people like Ned who assume that whatever phenomenal consciousness is, it's a property of a first order state. And then they try to mount an argument that it's a property that that state has even when we actually don't access it, so it's independent of access. Although Ned is probably can be characterized as retreating a bit late to the claim that it's accessibility which may be the relation here, and so that's one step closer to access, but that's a topic for another day. So on the other hand, then, we have a conception of phenomenal consciousness merely as mental appearances. So David has been explicit about this, and so is Josh in his writings. The idea here is that when we say that there's something that it's like for one, we merely mean that one's mental life appears in a certain way. So that if what it's like for you is like seeing blue, then we would want to say, well, the mental appearances are such that you seem to see blue, or it appears to you that you're seeing blue. So given that, then, if we think of phenomenal consciousness as merely mental appearances, then we don't have this problem, because here again in the empty higher order representation case, we still have the appearance, since it's the higher order state which accounts for the appearances. So we still have mental appearances. Now, one worry with this way of responding is that we wonder, well, which state is it that's phenomenally conscious? And one way of handling that is sort of someone like Jacob Berger might say, well, and this is supported by things that Rosenthal has said in various places, is to say, well, look, it's not the state which has the property, but the person. The person has the property of being phenomenally conscious. And I certainly agree that that's true, but of course the person has that property in virtue of being in a certain state. And so if we wanted to know, well, which state is it, we would say it's the higher order state itself. So this is the view that I will be defending, namely the view that the higher order representation itself is phenomenally conscious, and even in a good case. So here we have our first order state here, a representation of something out in the world. We have the higher order state, and then which state is the seeing of yellow consciously? Well, it's the higher order state. So this is something that I have called the horror theory of phenomenal consciousness, and horror stands for higher order representation of a representation. So now I just coined this term here to distinguish it from the traditional higher order thought theory. So if sometimes I think that this is merely a terminological variant from the way that David and Josh characterized the theory. Other times I think maybe it's a bit more substantial than that. But either way, it's good to have a name for whatever you think this is, either a different theory or an alternative way of talking. So when I talk about horror theory of phenomenal consciousness, I mean to say that phenomenal consciousness just is the higher order thought itself. That's what phenomenal consciousness is. So if we wanted to sort of metaphorically say which state is it that lights up, it would be the higher order state itself. Now, Ned has in places talked about this, and we'll get to his response in just a second, but I think that we can see a very clear difference between two different issues here. So if you look at the debate between Ned and David, they are arguing over whether or not first order qualitative states always occur consciously, in the sense that there's always something that it's like for one to have those states, whether or not one is aware of them. So David will say, no, of course not, because phenomenal consciousness is mental appearances, And when you are unaware of those states in any sense at all, it doesn't appear to you as though you're in that state, so there's nothing that it's like for you. Ned will say yes, because he's thinking of phenomenal consciousness as a property of first order states of seeing red and so forth, so that whenever they occur, if it's the first order state of seeing phenomenal red, then it should be like seeing red for you. So that's one debate. What do you say about those first order states? And then the slightly different debate that I'm trying to introduce here is, well, what state correctly is characterized as having the property of there being something that it's like for you to be in that state? So is it the first order state or the higher order representation of those states? So that the horror theory says it's the higher order states, and it also agrees with Rosenthal that the first order states can occur unconsciously. And in fact, it turns out that they never are phenomenally conscious in this sense. There's never something that it's like for you to be in the first order state. And that is a way of distinguishing these various views. Now, as I mentioned previously, Bloch himself is aware of this kind of move, and this is a quote from his response to Weisberg and Rosenthal, which appeared in Analysis recently. So he says, quote, "There is, however, a way out to say that what its likeness is a property of the hot itself. That is, the hot, in a case of an empty hot, is the very state that is conscious and has what its likeness. However, it is not clear how this view can preserve the insight that a conscious state is a state one is conscious of. Perhaps the hot is always self-reflexive, a state of consciousness of itself. But as noted earlier, this would be a version of the rival same-order theory." So this, to me, characterizes a misunderstanding which I think Bloch is harboring. So if we remind ourselves of the various kinds of consciousness which have been distinguished in the literature over the past 25 years or so as people have been discussing this, we start off by thinking about, well, creatures are awake or asleep, and we get the notion of creature consciousness. We move to the idea, well, we could be aware of things in our environments, and so we have this idea of transitive consciousness, that term coined by David Rosenthal. And then, of course, we can have states of consciousness which are themselves unconscious. So we could have transitive consciousness. I could be aware of something in my environment, and I could be consciously aware of something in my environment or unconsciously aware of something in my environment. Now, we would distinguish that from perhaps a kind of access, which we might identify with availability or being globally broadcast or something like that. And then we can distinguish introspection, which is sort of being conscious of which conscious mental states we're in. And then finally, we can distinguish phenomenal consciousness, which is simply the property of there being something that it's like for you to be in any given mental state. So these are different concepts of consciousness. And what Bloch has done in his previous quote is to conflate state consciousness with phenomenal consciousness. State consciousness is simply a matter of my being aware of some state, and phenomenal consciousness is a matter of there being something that is like for me to be in a given state. So if we return back to our empty higher order case here, we have the, if we return to our normal case here, so here is a typical situation as the horror theory would describe it. You have the first order qualitative state, that's the translucent square there. You have the higher order representation of that representation, that's the yellow non-opaque translucent square there. And you have the target relationship, the referring relationship, the targeting relationship, the whatever you want to call it relationship, which is characterized by the arrow there. So in this case then, the higher order state is phenomenally conscious in the sense that that is the state which is making it the case that what it's like for you is like seeing yellow, right? That's the state that there's something that it's like for you to be in. But the mental state, which we would call the conscious mental state in the sense of being state conscious, is just the first order state. It's the target of the higher order representation. So you have two things. You have the higher order representation itself, and you have the target of the higher order representation. Those are two separate things. And according to the horror theory, one of them corresponds to phenomenal consciousness, the higher order representation itself, and the other corresponds to state consciousness, the target. So we would still say that the first order state is the target, and therefore that's the state that's conscious in that sense, but we'd say the higher order state is the state that there's something that it's like for you to be in, and so it's conscious in this other sense, phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so that typically is the view. Now, I think this way of thinking about what's going on here is theoretically superior to a couple of alternatives. So here's one alternative. And this is the kind of alternative you might find from someone like Rocco Gennaro, maybe Uriah Kriegel, perhaps others. So you might say, well, look, when you have the first order state all by itself, there's nothing that it's like for you to be in that state. And when you have the higher order state all by itself, there still is nothing that it's like for you to be in it. But rather, when you have the first order state and the higher order state, and those are combined in the right way, there's the right relationship between them, then you get the conscious mental state. And notice so that on this view, the higher order state is itself unconscious. It's the first order state which gets lit up by this relationship between them, as exemplified by the arrow and the circle here. And so you might say, well, look, so then there's no problem, because in the empty higher order case, we don't have a conscious mental state. There's no first order state there to be conscious, and so we don't have a problem, right? It's just there's no state to be conscious, so there's nothing that happens. Now, the problem with this view is that it actually misses the point of the objection, because this is sort of Bloch's point. If you accept the transitivity principle, then you have to say that there is a conscious mental state at that time, because a conscious mental state, because the higher order state is a sufficient condition for there being a conscious mental state, right? That's what the transitivity principle in effect says. A conscious mental state is one that I am aware of myself as being in. So you're aware of yourself as being in one here, so why isn't there one? That's the more pressing question. And you can't say, oh, because there's no first order state there, because the transitivity principle doesn't say anything about a first order state. It says something about you being aware of yourself as being in the first order state. So if that kind of awareness is around, then you would have to explain why it doesn't result in there being consciousness, and where it would be begging the question is simply say, well, because there's no state that's actually there, right? Because that's not what matters. Slightly better view is that which Hakuan Lau develops, and he and I developed this in a bit more detail in our jointly authored paper, The Emperor's New Phenomenology. So on this view, when you have the first order state, there's nothing that it's like for you. And when you have the higher order state, there is something that it's like for you. It lights up the first order state in a sense. But of course, the difference is that Hakuan splits the content between the two states, so that in the higher order state, you get a roughly, I'm aware of myself as seeing something or other, and then what it is you're actually seeing is determined by the first order state. So that in this case, if you were to see a certain shade of yellow, it would be because that first order state represents a certain shade of yellow. And the big difference here is that in the case where you don't have that first order state, Hakuan is going to allow that there still is phenomenology there still is consciousness, because there's the higher order state of being aware of yourself as seeing something or other. So the difference between the two cases for Hakuan will be that in the case where the first order state is actually there, you will actually have the color phenomenology of the specific shade, whereas in the other case you won't have that specific phenomenology. You'll just have this sort of general phenomenology of seeing something or other, and so you won't actually consciously experience the specific color. Now this is an advance over the other kind of view in that it recognizes the role that the higher order awareness plays. That's what's driving the mental appearances here. That's what's doing the work. But it has the opposite problem of the Gennaro-Kriegel type view. So remember, for that view, it was like the question was, given that you have the same awareness, why doesn't that result in the same kind of mental appearances? And there doesn't seem to be any good non-ad hoc way of doing that. Whereas here we'd get the opposite problem. So you have the first order state, which is somehow contributing yellowness to the phenomenology, and it's doing that when you're aware of that state. But the question would be why it's not going to be doing that even when you're unaware of it. So why isn't this just going to collapse into a kind of first order view which says that it's going to be phenomenally conscious whether you're aware of it or not, right? There's no good reason, no good explanation for how merely pointing at a particular state will light it up. Now you can say it fits the data better, you can say that's just what I stipulate, but you don't get an explanation of the kind that you get on the horror theory or even on the traditional higher order thought view. So I think that of these alternatives, the horror theory is the best, right? It's a way of talking about phenomenal consciousness in a way that's serious, in a way that puts it into the theoretical machinery of the higher order theory, and says what I think the ambitious higher order theory really has been saying all along, which is just that, look, phenomenal consciousness might really just be a higher order representation. Let's go ahead and turn to the empirical argument then. So what I want to start with is just really quickly looking at the traditional argument, which has been developed by David Rosenthal and to some extent others, which is in support of the ambitious higher order theory. So this line of argument starts from the undisputable fact, it seems, that learning new concepts can change one's conscious experience to include qualities corresponding to those concepts. So for instance, the classic example is wine tasting. You taste some wine, you have a certain first order experience, you learn about oakiness and tannin, and suddenly your experience seems different to you. Of course, the same could be said for music. You're listening to a certain piece, you don't have the concept of a bass clarinet, you acquire that concept and the experience changes. So now Rosenthal has most explicitly developed this in a couple of papers where he suggests that if concepts can make a difference between these, introducing new qualities into your experience and thus making a difference between the experience of the orchestra without the concept of bass clarinet and the difference between that and the experience of the orchestra with the concept of bass clarinet, then maybe applying concepts in the first place can be the source of all phenomenology. Now the problem with that, one very general problem, which I think is probably the most serious problem, is that you can't rule out top-down effects in these cases. So there's actual empirical evidence which suggests that when people have these kind of higher order states where they interpret themselves as being in a certain first order state, that actually can change the activity in the first order areas and generate those states. So you can't rule out the case that the reason why there's a difference in your phenomenology when you acquire the concept of a bass clarinet or of oakiness is because by having that concept you've actually introduced a new quality at the first order level, so that it's not just due to conceptualizing what was already there, but that employing the concept actually brings about the first order state. So So this is not a fatal objection, but it does show that this datum, this piece of evidence, doesn't push us one way or the other, because you could agree that there's this change, but then deny that it's because of applying the concept. Say, no, it does something in the first order state. Or you could say, yes, there's this change because you're applying the concept, and then draw the conclusion that applying concepts generates phenomenology. So I think that this argument, though interesting and a good area to look into because there's some empirical predictions, but we can give a better argument. And I think this one is slightly less well known. So I want to focus on some work coming out of Haquan Lau's lab, and in particular the experiments done with Dobi Ranev, who's a graduate student in Haquan's lab and soon will be on the market. So I want to start by looking at a recent paper of theirs which just came out in Nature Neuroscience, which gives us a series of experiments, and then look at really quickly just some brief follow-up stuff. So let's just really quickly look at the experimental setup here. So we're looking at an image of the task, and you, as a subject, will be seated in front of a computer. You're asked to fixate on this red dot in the middle of a gray screen, and then there is a pre-cue stimulus which comes on, either pointing in one diagonal or another diagonal. So in this case, it's pointing to the left-right diagonal, although in other cases it could be pointing to the right-left diagonal. So that cue comes on for 500 milliseconds, and then so this cue is supposed to direct your attention. It tells you where the target is likely going to be, and so in this case you should be attending along that diagonal there, either to the left or to the bottom right, and then they flash these four squares there for 360 milliseconds, and then they probe an area and ask you simply, was there something there or not? So in this case, the answer would be no, there was nothing there, because what was presented was a noise pattern, not a target pattern, which are the gratings, which are superimposed over that noisy background. Now, because we know about certain effects of attention, what they did was to manipulate the contrasts of the stimuli which appear in the unattended area or the uncued area, and so that those would be higher contrast, and they did that so that they can match performance, so that the people would do equally well in either the attended or the unattended areas. Now, just before we get to the results, give you a couple of quick more details here. So the gratings appeared on 50% of the trials, and the probabilities here were independent, so that subjects couldn't learn or to predict whether there would be a grating or not. And the pre-cue stimulus was valid 70% of the times, and subjects were informed of that fact, so that there is a 70% chance that wherever the cue pointed to, the target would actually be there. And the reason for that was that it really encourages the subjects to attend to the area that's being cued, because they know that it's highly likely overall that the target will appear there. And these trials were done in blocks, and subjects were given feedback on their performances. Okay, so what are the results? Well, what they did was to calculate two different values, which in the literature are known as D prime and also C, the criterion. So D prime is roughly a measure of the signal to noise, and this is computed mathematically from looking at excuse me. This is computed mathematically from looking at the number of hits, and where a hit is that there is a target there and the subject says there's a target there, as compared to the number of false alarms, where there is no target there and the subject says that there is one. And roughly D prime is the hit rate, the difference between the hit rate and the false alarm rate after each of those values has been transformed for normalization reasons, what's called the Z transform. And if you want to know about that, we can talk about it, but it's not really necessary here. The basic idea is that D prime gives us some theoretical assessment of how reliable or how much fidelity there is in the signal, or overall how much information there is in the signal as composed to noise. So we can find cases where the information amount is matched, so the D prime is matched. Now C here is another calculation which which gives us some idea of the report bias or the criterion that these subjects are employing, so that when you have a conservative bias, you are very excuse me, you need very strong evidence that there's a target there before you'll say yes. So with a conservative bias, your propensity to say no is that no, there was no target is very strong. You need very strong evidence to override that and to actually say there was a target there. Whereas if you have a liberal bias or criterion, then you are more likely to say yes, there is something there overall. Whether there is something there, whether there isn't something there. You need very little evidence to go ahead and say, yes, there is something there. So the results of the first experiment show that when you compute these values from the behavioral data, from the number of hits they get compared to the number of false alarms, and you compute these values using normal statistical methods, then you can find cases where the D prime is matched, but the criterions are very different. So what this is that what this suggests is that the amount of information in the signal is the same in both cases because there's no statistical difference in the D prime. And yet in one case they are very reluctant to say that they saw something there, and in the other case they're very happy or liberally say that they saw things, that they detected a target. So now this is interesting because there's the same amount of information according to D prime, and yet there's this difference in their subjective reports. In one case they say they're more likely to say yes, there's something there. In another case they're more likely to say no, that there isn't something there. So what this suggests is that we have two dissociable things. One, a measure of how much information is at the first order level, how much information is at the first order representational level, and that would be D prime. And then on the other hand, we have the subjective report about whether they see something or not, and that is seemingly varying independent of how much information is there, and that suggests that maybe this is an indicator of the kind of conscious experience that the subjects are having, and that this comes apart from the amount of information that's being processed. So that's very interesting. And so what they did is to see whether or not this was some kind of cognitive bias. Because you might think, well, look, what's going on here is just that they have this phenomenal experience, and yet for some reason they're not able to report it in one case, and they are in the other case, or that they have some cognitive bias, but it's not a perceptual effect. Well, so in order to test that, what they did was a lot of controls. So here they're showing controls for when you pay them, and there's a system where you give them points and they get money based on how many points, a point for getting it right and so forth. There's a system where the highest performer performing subject gets a $10 bonus, so that there's a lot of incentive to really do well. So that doesn't change anything. You can still find these two dissociable cases where D prime is matched and yet the criterions are different. The reporting, in one case they see something more often, in another case they don't more often. And then you can give them payoff plus feedback, where after each block you sort of say, well, try these strategies, do this, etc., and tell them how they were getting it right, when they were getting it wrong, and yet there still doesn't affect the D prime or C values. You can use the stimulus duration be shorter. You can track eye movement and make sure make sure they're really attending to the areas that they say they are, and etc. You can do all of these things, and the effect is just as strong in each case. Now, Hakwan and I argue in our The Emperor's New Phenomenology paper that this suggests something very perceptual, something perception based, not cognitively based, because it seems impenetrable in the right kind of way, right? It's not just some kind of cognitive bias that you can get rid of by revealing the bias or training the bias away. It seems to be some kind of perceptual effect that's going on here. And just in case you think, well, look, well, the contrast of the two stimuli were different, so maybe it's just that they're more likely to say they saw something in the unattended region because it's got objectively more contrast than the area they're attending to. But what they were able to show, and I don't show this graph here, although we can talk about it, is that when you control for that and do a regression analysis, there's always this more conservative bias effect of attention, even when those other things are controlled for. So you'll get a smaller effect overall, but there still will be this difference. So this really seems like a robust effect. It seems like a perceptual effect. And so at first glance, it really looks like what's going on here is we found an interesting way to measure or think about the difference between first order information and then higher order representations of how much information is there, and that these correlate nicely with unconscious qualitative states and conscious higher order states. Okay, so now to test this further, they performed a second series of experiments, which are similar to the first set, but are trying to get at this issue more directly. So the task here is roughly the same. You fixate at the center, you're given a cue, and then the stimulus appears. But here, instead of just saying whether there's a target or noise, what you're trying to do is determine whether or not the gratings, which are in the probed areas, are left tilted or right tilted. So you fixate, you're cued. So in this case, the cue tells you to attend to the right-left diagonal in some way. And then afterwards, they're asking you about the other diagonal. And then so you would try to report which direction that grating was tilted. In this case, it would be right tilted. And then on top of that, you're asked about visibility. So how visible was it? And what's very interesting is that you can find cases that where the D prime is matched between the cued and the uncued areas again, so that you're performing equally well on saying whether or not the gratings in the probed areas are right tilted or left tilted, but you can find this huge dissociation in visibility reports. So in the cued area, when you cue them there and then you ask them in that same area, how visible were those things? So they're getting it right, left or right. They're getting that correct. And then you say, how visible was that? They give much lower visibility ratings. But in the uncued areas, so you cue them to some quadrant, some diagonal, and then you ask about the area that was uncued, and they're saying that that was much more visible, that the stuff there was higher. And they're performing equally well in both cases. So now this again is we suggest stronger evidence for the claim that this is something perceptual that's going on here, because now they're reporting how visible something is. And it seems as though they are claiming that there's more visibility, even though there's the same amount of information in the channel as measured by D prime. So these mathematical tools suggest that there is this difference. And so this seems like at least very suggestive empirical evidence that there's a difference between information at the first order level and then consciousness of that information and the effect that that has on the subject's phenomenology. So, but we've been just looking at behavioral data. So remember that D prime and C and visibility ratings and these things, these are, so D prime especially and the criterion thing are mathematical computations, calculations based on hit rates and false alarm rates. And then visibility ratings, again, are just verbal reports. So, but we haven't looked at anything going on in the brain. We've just been looking at behavioral data. So in a follow-up study, which we'll just mention briefly here, what they did was try to do some fMRI data. So this is a slightly different task than the previous kinds of tasks. But here you're fixating at this center point and there's these dots, and then you're going to be in these one of two conditions. Either there will be coherent motion in one direction, so all the little dots will move sort of outward or inward as a coherent thing, or there will be this random motion where the dots are moving randomly. And then you ask them, were these dots moving coherently or randomly? And participants come in, they get trained on this task before they go into the fMRI, so they understand the task very well. And there's no manipulation of attention in this experiment, so they just get to attend how they want. They identified the endogenous intentional areas, which they identify as the dorsal attention system, and then they also looked at area MT plus, and they identified these, and then they put these subjects in the scanner and they let them do whatever they want, and then so they identify lower activity in the dorsal area as low state of attention and higher activity as a high state of attention. And what they found was that when there is a high level of activity in the dorsal attention network, which remember we're associating with a high level of attention because these areas are implicated in this kind of attention and there's more activity there, so there should be evidence that they're attending, then what you get is a lower confidence rating about whether they're getting it right. So a slightly higher performance, right? They're doing better. They're doing better under the states of high attention, but they're less confident in how well they're doing. And you can see from the fMRI data here that there really is no difference in the activation of the first order areas when they're doing better or when they're not doing better. So what this suggests, you combine these three studies together, so we have evidence that there's this distinction between the amount of information there and the higher order awareness of that information. And then we look at a similar kind of case in the scanner, and we find that there's comparable levels of activity in the first order areas, even when there's this dissociation and difference in higher order areas. And so that this maps on what seems to be coming out of this is this overall argument that the best interpretation is that you have representations of first order information in the lower visual areas, you have higher order representations in the higher areas, and that you can have a difference in consciousness, in your conscious phenomenology, where you have the same level of activity, right? The D prime is the same, and the level of activation in the early visual areas is the same, and yet there's a difference in conscious experience. So that seems to suggest that the difference in conscious experience has to be due solely to the higher order activity. And then because of time constraints, I can't talk about some other studies, but maybe in discussion we could. Some Lau and Passingham studies, for instance, where they use TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and show that they can induce blind sight-like results in normal subjects by zapping the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or areas in that area. So overall then, the work that's coming out of this lab is developing a very nice empirical case that you can have conscious experience when the first order representations or the amount of information at the first order level is unchanged. And that seems to be very strong evidence for some kind of higher order theory. So let me just then step back and make the conclusion here that when you look at these two converging lines, the philosophical argument, which seems to suggest that if you are a higher order theorist, you should adopt something like what I call the horror theory and claim that phenomenal consciousness just is due to higher order thoughts, or just is a higher order representation. And then you look at the empirical evidence coming out of Haquan's lab, and that seems to provide a very strong case that conscious experience is due only to the activity of these higher order areas. Again, because you can have the same level of information at the first order level, no difference, no large difference in fMRI activity, and yet a difference in conscious experience. So you put these two together, and I think that you have a pretty strong case that conscious phenomenology just is higher order activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And with that, I'll end and take any questions. Thank you.